Welcome back to Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Well, today I'm very pleased to be able to present the second installment of the interview series with Dr. Odin Knudsen. Except today there's going to be a slight role reversal. It's actually going to be Odin interviewing me about the specific topic of prospects for improvements in relations with Russia and looking at that through the lens of some of the experiences that I had being deeply involved in the Russian energy and environmental markets during the period of around about 2006 through to 2013-14. So without any further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, Daniel, it's good seeing you again. It's my turn to interview you. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and we're going to obviously discuss Russia and Ukraine and the future there. So tell me a little bit about your experience with Russia, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Odin. It's great to reverse the roles, as it were, and discuss in this way. So thank you. Well, aside from the fact that I actually studied Russia as part of my modern European histories studies when I was a high school student in Australia, I had my first business experiences with the country actually when I joined Enel, the Italian energy utility in Rome, where I was involved in an acquisition that was made of a Russian electricity business called OGK5, which I think is now called Enel Russia, and had been involved in that acquisition around 2006-07. And then not so long after that, I left Enel and actually joined JP Morgan. And that's where I actually had the privilege, as a result of a lot of support that I received from you, to actually start to develop the carbon-related business in Russia. So my job was to then go to Russia and work with the clients that the bank had to see if there was potential to develop some projects and actually then purchase the carbon credits for then distribution back into the European market, as well as the Japanese market, which was quite interested in those carbon credits in that period. So that period lasted from about 2008 to 2012-13. And so there was a very substantial amount of time that I spent in Russia as a result of some of the success that came through the JP Morgan business. I was then also asked to expand the business into energy-related commodity dealing. So that was a great privilege as well, and also working with a lot of important Russian enterprises. And of course, being based in London at the time, I was able to go to Russia very frequently without necessarily being, resident in Russia. I was able to travel very regularly. So, it gave me a great opportunity to know and understand the Russian business market and also some of the politics that applied at the time, specifically as it related to energy and environmental markets. And then, of course, that also extended into business dealings in places like Ukraine and then in the Caucasus countries. And I remember actually visiting places like Georgia with you back in, I think it was 2010. So that is a little bit of an illustration, probably a 6 or 7 year period where I was very intensely involved in that part of the world, and in particular with Russia, which I consider to be today, quite a privilege. As well as the fact that since then there's been a deterioration in business and other relations between Russia and a lot of the collective West. So there's probably some information and insight that I have which is not necessarily accessible to a lot of people today. So that's a little bit of an overview of my background.
And before we go deeper into the Russian invasion, basically, of Ukraine. So what was the climate like during that period in terms of Russia? What was there's discussion that today, that it was imperialistic, Russia was imperialistic, was Russia's, I was in Russia the Soviet Union then in 1991 when the whole thing collapsed.
Hmm.
and um, uh, it was probably the deepest hole of Russia and the Soviet Union at the time, and the whole thing was unraveling. And I just remember this incredible depression that took place there. But you were there. Was it good times? Was it like, did you feel the optimism? Did you feel the beast expanding? What was it like?
It's a very good question. And I've often thought long and hard about this because, in principle, the period during which I was going there and working, it was very much during this opening up, or this at least perceived opening up of Russia to international business interests and so forth. So there was a part of me which detected a real internationalization of Russia, especially, I mean, Moscow being the base where I used to go because the JP Morgan office particularly was in Moscow. I also traveled around the country a lot for site visits and things like that as well. But I could definitely feel an internationalization taking place and a genuine interest on the Russian side to be involved in international business and investment. At the same time, I could always feel something in behind the scenes which told me that there was something different about Russia when compared to some of the other developing countries or emerging markets where I'd been doing business. And no more clear was that to me than the time that you and I visited Georgia, because I was, if you recall, I was actually in Russia at the time when we were asked to go to Georgia. And I quickly found out, I mean, I knew there was a conflict going on in 2008 between Georgia and Russia, but there were literally no direct flights for me to take from Moscow to Tbilisi. And so I had to literally take a Ukrainian international flight to Kiev, where I got a connection back into Tbilisi. And that made me wonder, what's going on here? And then when we arrived in Tbilisi, I sort of it struck me that there was a much deeper issue at play. So I sort of understood at the same time, yes, there's this internationalization going on and integration of Russia business-wise, but it wasn't fully resolved. And so I think the sentiment, I could feel it, but it's only been in the last, let's say, 10 years since the Maidan revolution and everything that's followed from that, that it's become clear that there are some unresolved matters affecting particularly the collective West's relationship with Russia. I don't see it as being unresolvable, but I do definitely think that there are still some matters that require resolution. So in some respects, I actually don't think there's been a full resolution of the way that the Cold War ended. And the other thing, which probably will be the last thing that I say, is that, and a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate this, is exactly what kind of turmoil Russia was in during the 90s and this whole rise, if you like, of the oligarch class in amongst that turmoil, and in fact the sovereign default of Russia in 1998, which is essentially a rich country from a resource perspective and a labor perspective, how it ended up defaulting in 1998. So there's a lot of, I think, awareness that people need to have. Like when we try to understand where Russia is today with respect to its relations with the West, I think the 90s and that the rise of the oligarchs and the Yeltsin years and so forth need to be very well understood. And I have to admit, when I started doing business in Russia, I was not as aware of all of that. That was a blind spot for me. And I sort of, I did a lot of work to try and educate myself on what went on. But I think that's also a really important matter that sits in the past that affects how things are going in the current era.
It's an interesting point because my perspective on it was there in the 90s when everything fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a proud country that was totally humiliated. You know, no food in Moscow, people lining up, no jobs, the currency totally devalued. You paid for taxi cab with Marlboro cigarettes. It was depressing. It was hugely depressing. And then the contrast, you go into, like when we were in Georgia together, the fear of the Georgians of Russia was, whoa, they were developing all those little small hydros and medium scale hydros and everything else because the Russians had their energy, had the dam
Yes.
up there. And it was just like, where's the world here? So it's interesting to look at it from a historic point of view, and the rise of Russia today. The transformation. After this terrible error that I think that Jeffrey Sachs put there, where you're selling all the stocks in bargain rates and putting them up for auction, which created the oligarchies, and that class. And so the transformation was huge. Not the concentration of economic power and things. So how do you see then the rise of Putin during that period? And obviously we'll move into what is the big question: is the why Russia invaded Ukraine
Mm.
and what the prospects of that are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the rise of Putin, um, and it's important to add that in the period where I was actively traveling to and working with Russia, Vladimir Putin was actually not the president. He'd finished his term, was actually the prime minister at the time, but it was actually Dmitry Medvedev who was the president in that period. And then eventually Putin was able to return, I think in 2012 was the year. So funnily enough, during my first person experience, I didn't really, I mean, I knew who Putin was, and but he wasn't certainly the president. So he was just another person that we needed to follow and study. But really, the main game was trying to understand the directions that were coming through Medvedev. The return of Putin has been a very interesting one, and it's been characterized, I think, in the mainstream media in the West, at least, as being sort of some type of a democratic process and so forth, which I think is a slightly unfair way to characterize the way politics works in Russia, but rightly or wrongly, that's the way people have understood things. But I think if one goes back in Russian history to understand how transitions of power have occurred and so forth, it usually takes 3 or 4 years for changes in head of state leadership to really bed in and result in some type of legitimate authority that at the presidential level or head of state level. So I would see Vladimir Putin as being a part of this overall phenomenon. The issue that I've got, though, or that keeps me, not keeps me up at night, I mean, a lot of things that keep me up at night, but this isn't one of them, but something I think about a lot is what the transition of power will be. And I'm not suggesting that there's anything imminent that could affect his position, but age suggests that there's going to be a limit for how long he can hold that role. And there's also, if you look at the inner circle of people, whether it be Lavrov or Dmitry Peskov, these sorts of people who speak on his behalf a lot of the time, Lavrov being the foreign minister, these guys are all around the same age. So there is a question, and it may not be anything that arises as a result of these conflicts that are going on or the economic sanctions, but it may just be biology at work. But there is a question: what will happen in the face of a necessary change in leadership? And that's where it may not happen, for 5-10 years or whatever, but that's where Russia will really, I think we'll get to see the real Russia, or the mature modern Russia, when that particular moment arises.
As we move toward the invasion of Ukraine, what role did the energy play in Russia? The transformation of energy and the ownership of the energy. So maybe you could just outline a little bit of that, and it brings us to today, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago.
Yeah, well, it's impossible. I think it's impossible to talk about the functioning of Russia without acknowledging just how important energy is. I certainly got a baptism on that one when I first flew to from Moscow to Surgut in Siberia for a site visit, where I actually arrived during the night, and I could actually see, but just by looking out the plane, just how many gas flares there were down below, which is essentially the associated petroleum gas flaring that was happening. I mean, it's enormous, and I didn't fully appreciate how enormous that was. But whether it be gas, oil, or other forms of energy, Russia really is in a strong position. It's not only for its own domestic demand, but it's exporting. What we've seen, though, is that notwithstanding all this transition from communism, collapse of the Soviet Union, and so forth, there's been a fairly good relationship between Europe and Russia, because Europe needs energy and Russia can supply energy. So actually, in the lead up to, let's say, the period where we had the Maidan Revolution in 2014, the reliability of Russia as a supplier of energy on an export basis, which is a very important thing for the Russian economy, of course, to have those exports. One of the main blocking points was actually, funnily enough, Ukraine. And there's a sort of a litany of gas-related transit disputes that were occurring, and were actually the basis on which European countries and Russia got together and then designed different projects like the Nord Stream pipelines. There was a South Stream pipeline that was developed over a 7 or 8 year period, which was eventually mothballed. But all these efforts to find alternatives to allow commerce in energy to take place between Europe and Russia, because there was this block in Ukraine. You know, that if the pipelines are all, the most of the gas is going through Ukraine, Ukraine can actually, to a certain extent, influence that, and that was very visible at the time. The other thing, when I think I visited Russia in about 2012, which was after Vladimir Putin had been confirmed as the new president to take over from Medvedev, but before he'd actually taken power. And I'd had a meeting with someone in the Ministry for Economic Development who told me about the efforts that were being made to start building pipelines and supplying gas to China. And that's where it became clear they were talking about the Far East. And I think that Russia has had it in mind for a long time that it needed to diversify away from this dependence on European exports because of the transit-related problems and other matters. I don't think conflict with Europe was an issue. It was more the dealing with this the volatility, if you like, with Ukraine. But it was clear to me, and has been for more than a decade, that Russia's efforts were to diversify its options and extend, for commercial reasons rather than geopolitical reasons, to places like China, and, as the Russians, the expression that was being used all the time was the Far East. So I think that is part of what I understand to be the overall role that, as a major export income earner for the country, which is of critical importance to its domestic stability, economic stability, as well as political stability. I think some of the major factors driving that over the last 15, 20 years, from my experience.
So, I mean, if we go ahead now to the invasion of Crimea, why? Was there I mean, you can start to see now sort of the invasion of Ukraine had an economic piece to it.
Mm.
We invade Ukraine, we got the pipeline, we got the control over the pipeline, right? Is that the argument? What about Crimea? What was happening? I mean, there's two views of Russia. One is, like we talked about, Putin has the greater vision of Russia, bringing Russia to be the imperial power that it was historically, way back, or the imperial power it was when it was the Soviet Union and things. Or is there a more fundamental thing? Was it we want Crimea, we want Ukraine. What's going on there? Why? Why? Economics, imperialism. Putin wants it as a trophy.
Yeah, I mean, as with most things, there are always two sides to every argument, and I think this one probably has even more sides. But I guess as far as the audience is concerned, they probably mostly hear the kind of pro-Western side of the argument, which is literally that, you know, there's an expansionist power there that's trying to, you know, subjugate neighbors. And once it's finished in Ukraine, it's going to move on to the next country and so forth. So we acknowledge that that view is out there. But I actually don't think there's a lot of evidence to support that from a military standpoint, because if you look at the initial force that Russia took into Ukraine in 2022, so this is predating Crimea, which was essentially less of a military conflict and more of a sort of an acknowledgement that there was a Russian ethnic population that wanted, in the face of what Russia and Russian speakers had perceived as being a coup d'etat in 2014, some degree of protection, and also the fact that there's a navy base for Russia in Crimea that has always been there, and it needed to, you know, secure Crimea for those purposes. But I think when you look at the military force that Russia took into Ukraine, at least initially, it was quite clear that there was, you know, I think it was about 200,000 troops in the army at the time. That does not suggest that there was an imperialist expansion interest there. Most military scholars that talk about this will acknowledge that if you, if you're going to start trying to occupy other countries, you're going to need a lot more forces than that. And it wasn't until sort of it became clear that Ukraine was pushing back. There was a negotiation in April of 2022, very early on in the conflict, that could have led to a resolution, but there were some factors that led Ukraine to decide not to abandon that process and to try and push ahead. Of course, there were also the Minsk agreements that happened throughout the 2010s decades, which attempted to do the same thing, that Russia needed to beef up its military activities and forces. And but really, the other really important thing for people to know and understand is that the areas that are currently occupied by Russia in the east of Ukraine, as well as Crimea are predominantly Russian-speaking provinces, or oblasts, as they're called. And I think if one was to present the Russian perspective, it would be that this is, if you've got a government in Kiev, which has essentially come about through a coup d'etat, that, and if they're undertaking measures to prevent the populations in the east of the country from using Russian language and fostering their ties with Russia, that there's a degree of protection that's needed in those provinces. So that's the alternative view, that it's not expansionist and it's more focused on, protection, if you like, of ethnic Russians. However, the other thing that's absolutely clear is that the Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, those sorts of areas actually contain a lot of the mineral deposits and generate a lot of the wealth, the industrial wealth of Ukraine. So it's impossible to talk about that without actually trying to sort of understand the economic motivations that might have been there as well. So in summary, Odin, I don't really know the answer, but what I do know is that there are definitely other sides of the argument, and what I would like to be able to do is to sort of contribute to a balanced appraisal of all of this that maybe counteracts a little bit some of the fairly common perceptions that one hears coming through regularly in whether it be mainstream or alternative media in the Western world.
That's interesting. But, why? I mean, you could say, well, there's Russian speakers in the United States. The second major language in the United States is Spanish.
Yes.
And, but right now we're not under, a direct invasion of Mexico into the country. So, it's where they discriminated against the Russians and the Russian speakers in those countries, or was it something like, yeah, they should be belong to us because they're Russians? What is the, so you can't say that. And then the other thing you hear is that, well, Russia did it because NATO expanded,
Mm.
and we need Ukraine to counter this NATO expansion that's taking place. I mean, it's almost like a paranoia, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting point, and if one looks at NATO expand, because the common view that one hears in the Western media, particularly, is that Ukraine's a sovereign country; they can pick and choose which military alliances they choose to join, and there's a degree of truth in that. I mean, in principle. However, we're talking about a potentially hostile military alliance, essentially having a border, a direct border, which is completely flat with Russia. So there's, geographically, when one travels to, the Donbass area, you can actually see it's very, very flat. There are no rivers. So, you effectively roll tanks across very easily if there's no defense there. So there's a soft point, if you like, on that border in particular. That's point number one. Point number two is, at some point we do probably need to recognize what are the legitimate security interests of a major power, if not a great power, or arguably a great power like Russia. And we can actually see how important military alliances are accumulating on your border just by looking at World War I history, where I think it was actually a telegram that suggested that Mexico was going to align itself with Germany, which actually became the basis on which the United States entered the war. So you can see very quickly, just by using historical precedent, how sensitive United States was to Mexico having military alliances with hostile partners at the time. And even today, if one imagined, what would happen if Mexico decided to develop some sort of military alliance with, let's say, an adversary or someone that was potentially seen as hostile to the United States, and were carrying out military activities on the border, were funding, there was funding being given to Mexico to purchase weapons, some of which could reach deep into the United States. What would the United States do? And I think when one asks oneself that question, it's actually a lot easier to comprehend why that particular border between Russia and Ukraine is important, and why, if NATO is sort of kind of expanding regularly, that it might be viewed as hostile. So I think this comes down to understanding and respecting what are the legitimate security interests of countries. And so there are some people, Professor John Mearsheimer is a good one, who speaks a lot about the expansion of NATO. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, also talks about that. So I think there's some legitimacy there to understand that. And if there's going to be any kind of resolution, the gut feeling I have is that it's going to need to take that into account, because I can't see the Russians, after defending that principle now for 11 or 12 years militarily, as much as anything, that there's going to be any significant backtracking given the sunk costs that have been made and the reasonably dominant position that Russia has on the battlefield. I can't see much potential for Russia conceding on that NATO point. So if we want peace, it's probably going to need to encompass, to some extent, a recognition that NATO is part of the problem, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons,
Hmm.
it got a security guarantee,
Mm.
I think, from Europe and the United States. And I'm not sure exactly who the signatures of that guarantee were, but obviously I don't know, it didn't hold really. I think they probably would give up the nuclear weapons today if they if they had it. So it brings up an interesting issue in terms of the spread of nuclear weapons.
Mm.
We have Iran that wants nuclear weapons. We have, potentially Saudi Arabia wants a nuclear weapon. Um, Israel has a nuclear weapon. Uh, you know, would so, and what does the security guarantee really give you? What does the NATO guarantee give you? What is it brings up the other interesting question. I mean, the premise of NATO is that an attack of one country is an attack on all of them. But would the United States want to go to war over Lithuania? So you know it's a it's a world. I mean, from an economist's point of view, for me, you want to conquer a country, you conquer it economically, like China has. Mhm. That's how you do it. The borders become open, goods fly between each other, et cetera, et cetera. Um,
Mm.
militarily is an expensive way, highly expensive way to
Yeah.
dominate. And
It's a.
Russia,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, that's all right. I mean, I think one of the problems that Russia has is it's one of its problems and one of its benefits is energy dependence,
Hmm.
not from an imported point of view, but it's export. It's like a primary producer, you know, and that makes a country, incredibly vulnerable. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you look at Russia's, I mean, on one extreme, I think it was John McCain who once, in a fairly derogatory way, referred to Russia as being a gas station with nuclear weapons. And that's a sort of an extreme way of characterizing it, but which I don't think is the truth. But certainly, the fact that Russia is such a major energy exporter and relies so heavily upon that can't be a great thing. It's also a very, very big grain exporter too. So there are other, it's not just about energy, but energy is a very big part of the mix.
yeah,
But
and Ukraine, of course, is the grain too.
absolutely. But I think I'm very aligned with your way of thinking as an economist, Odin, in that, I think the answer to a lot of these problems will come through less focus on conflict, military style conflicts to resolve disagreements about who holds the balance of power, basically, who can kind of tell whom what to do, and more about trade.
Mhm.
Because I think, if you look at it as an economist, you'll say, well, Russia's got not only the resources, but it's got a comparative advantage in energy production, and of course, with the finance that they raise through that energy export industry, can then create demand for other things to be brought into Russia. So I think the ideal situation is where Russia is able to participate as a trading partner in the global economy, and that would include, of course, reinstating it to the SWIFT banking system and so forth. But yeah, I think there's a tendency right now for countries to try and flex their power through non-economic means. And that results, of course, in all sorts of problems. It's very costly, as you pointed out. And I'd certainly prefer that less time was spent, worrying about those sorts of things. Because, like, in an environment where people have nuclear weapons, the ultimate deterrent is there. There's no way you can defeat a major nuclear power, like bring about a strategic military defeat on a major nuclear power, because the minute that it becomes clear that that's going to happen, they've got the ultimate deterrent there. So there isn't going to be a decisive way to defeat someone like Russia without precipitating something very unsavory. So I think we need to, maybe it's time for a little bit more realistic and mature thinking on this topic about ways to resolve what's going on, to find an economic basis for continued cooperation. But of course, it requires people to let go of some of the main narratives that have been particularly circulating in the Western world about imperialism and things like that. And I'm not sure that everyone's ready to do that just yet.
It's interesting. I've had that one experience with the collapse of the Soviet Union and being in that area. But the other experience I have with indirect experience with Russia was during the East Asia financial crisis.
Mm.
So the World Bank, in cooperation with the IMF, we set up a war room. And because of my great success in the Middle East, bringing peace to the Middle East, I was put in charge of the war room, of essentially rescuing countries. And I remember very clearly that we were in South Korea and Thailand, Indonesia. We had 6 countries we could maybe get the resources. And the word came out, you don't need to rescue Russia because it's not that important to the world. And that was it, And it was kind of a shock to me that Russia was not economically important enough in the financial markets, in the global financial markets, to be worthy of rescuing. I remember Mexico was on the other side. Mexico, we didn't have the resources to rescue Mexico. The U.S. Treasury had to say, but the Russia wasn't significant enough. So it's kind of bizarre in many ways. So how do you see then? Put your prediction hat on. How does peace, now that we have peace in the Middle East from Trump, how do you see peace coming about in the Ukraine Russian war? What would be your forecast? And obviously, we're going to hold you accountable on this.
Yeah, well,
What's the pathway to peace? Is it militarily? Is it economically? Is it,
Mm.
and I just make one other point, which is an interesting one. I'm just thinking of. And I want to say this, and then I'm going to refine it, because if I say it just the sentence here, it won't make sense. The energy market is artificial. The petroleum, especially petroleum. Why do I say it's artificial? It's basically propped up by OPEC and the Saudis and Saudi Arabia. If countries in a chaotic situation of no kind of creating of oligarchy, the price of petroleum would collapse. It would be the price of a bottle of a scotch on Park Avenue. So, which is pretty expensive, actually. Maybe that wasn't a good analogy. Maybe one at Costco or something. But so that whole energy complex is vulnerable to just a lot of petroleum in the world, crude oil.
Yeah.
So how does this get resolved? That's the real thing. And how does it get resolved for the better interest of Europe and the better interest of the world at large, better interest of Ukraine, the better interest of Russia? Or will this thing just drag on and be
Yeah.
the Vietnam of Europe?
Yeah. I think if nothing is done, let's just say there's no specific intention on behalf of the West to meet Russia somewhere in the areas that Russia is putting forward, because at the end of the day, Russia is prevailing on the battlefield in Ukraine. If there's nothing done on the Western side, what we're going to end up with is probably going to be something much more similar, I would say, to the two Koreas, where you've got a kind of a frozen conflict with a buffer zone and permanent, deteriorating or bad relations. And I don't think that's going to suit anybody where this is concerned. So I'm hoping that is not going to prevail. And I think one of the reasons why it's not going to prevail is because President Trump has probably understood. We've seen the European Union has started to, funnily enough, agree with the United States on a whole range of other issues where pressure has been applied. And I think this may ultimately be another one where if President Trump really has the bit between the teeth on resolving the conflict in Ukraine, that the most important view is going to be the United States view as opposed to the European view in this respect. So I could foresee a potential solution here. And also because we kind of know that it's in the economic best interests of a lot of European countries to get back to good relations with Russia. The competitiveness of Germany, of Italy, is actually tied to the availability of low-cost, reliable suppliers of energy, as much as Russia needs the export revenues and so forth. So I do see scope for agreement. The problem is the political investment that's been made over a number of years makes it very difficult for there to be some type of off-ramp on this. For especially European politicians, it would have been the case also for the Biden administration. So the fact that Trump is there is probably a good thing because he doesn't have quite so much investment in that particular narrative. But I think there could be some difficult discussions to be had in European countries about how one reconciles any kind of change in policy. But I do see scope for it. So in terms of my crystal ball, I see it being a gradual process. But the point
is the point you're making that Europe has to let go of the fear that if they quote unquote there's a surrender on Ukraine, that this will motivate Putin to take on more, be more aggressive? Is it? What is the European perspective? What's an acceptable solution to the Europeans, and what do they have to let go of to get to that?
Well, I guess when we talk about collective Europe, it's very difficult to say there is a European position, a united European position, because there isn't. If one looks, for example, at countries like Spain, which are a long way away from, the actual conflict, they're much more moderate on this than, let's say, some other countries. Germany, France, the United Kingdom as well, very vocal in this particular, yeah, and Poland. Although Polish, there's been some interesting developments recently in Poland as well. But if you look alternatively at Slovakia or Hungary, they're very much in favor of not having any conflict or any, bad relations with Russia and want to carry on and so forth. So it's actually, and rightly or wrongly, there is a lot of this sentiment. So it's very difficult. You can't actually sit here and say the European Union should do this, or that there is scope for the European Union to do something when such wide disagreement exists within the EU. And so it's actually, it really is in this instance necessary to sort of single out, specific member states and so forth. And, because I think Hungary and Slovakia have been pretty clear for a long time about the direction in which they'd like to go. It's just that they've been unable to convince anybody else in that block of countries that's quite aggressively pushing against this.
And what would Hungary and Slovakia want?
What would they what? Sorry.
What do they want, Hungary and Slovakia?
Yeah, I mean, Hungary and Slovakia are of the view that they want gas supplies. I think, Slovakia has made it very clear that they want to carry on receiving gas from Russia. The Hungarians have made it reasonably clear, or at least the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, has made it fairly clear that first of all, there's no pathway to success in trying to strategically defeat Russia, but also that the European interest is not actually served by carrying on this type of conflict, and there's been threat conflation. So that's what they're saying. Of course, there's a lot of critics of those two countries, but they're part of the European Union. So, and the other one, the other country that's in all of this is Austria, which retains this neutral position, and I think that's got a lot of merit in it as well. Probably a little bit more focus on what Austria thinks is also as a neutral non-member of NATO is a really interesting one to understand better.
So basically, that solution would be give the Russians the territory that they've taken now, the Donbass area and the areas that they occupy, and freeze the situation and get on with business. Is that essentially the position?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think trying to, because at the moment, Russia has control of very large, probably 25% of the eastern part of Ukraine. So if one wants to compel Russia to let go, I mean, militarily, it's going to be extremely difficult to achieve. I mean, there was a counter-offensive in 2023 that Ukraine ran, which was spectacularly unsuccessful. So military means of asking Russia to leave those areas is basically off the table. So the real question is what can be done in a negotiated way, and is it possible to achieve that? And it will be very difficult because there's a big trust barrier, with the Minsk Accords. So this didn't just start, let's say, in 2022. There was also the Minsk Accords, which have caused significant problems. So there are trust issues there. So if there is going to be any kind of vacation of those provinces that are currently under Russian control, it's going to take years of trust building, but it has to stop with some type of recognition that there are legitimate security interests on both sides, and work from there. And there has to be a sort of a kind of a maturity at the level of the general public as well to understand that, and not, because one of the things at the moment for the politicians who've been so adamant on putting pressure on Russia and so forth is that they need to be given a pathway to be able to change somewhat or to modify, such that there isn't a massive, political fallout for them as a result of changing policy.
Good. So we'll see. So, is it easier to bring peace to the Middle East or bring peace to Ukraine and Russia? It's the last question.
I don't know if it's easier in one or the other, but it is my very sincere hope that both are practical and achievable. And more than hope, as a realist, or to a degree a realist on these sorts of matters, I think there's scope, because there is alignment of interest, even if there are some areas that where disagreement exists that currently require further attention. So I'm going to say it's possible, but it's not going to come easily.
No, I agree with that. Thank you, Daniel, for your insights.
Thank you, Odin.
Interesting discussion. I like the reverse role.
Thank you. And so there we have it. That's the interview where Odin discussed with me thoughts about the situation with Russia, the prospects for relations improving in the future, and with respect to some of the important history that has been in play relating to relations between Russia, the United States, and also the European Union in particular. But what do you think? What did you make of the interview? Did you agree with some of the points? Is there anything with which you disagree? Would you like to suggest anything else? Please let me know by making a comment below. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so. And remember that we also have a target to achieve 500 subscriptions by Christmas Day 2025. That's the 25th of December 2025. So if you know anybody else, whether that be your family, your friends or colleagues, whom you think would enjoy this type of content, then please do share the video with them and let them know as well about the target to achieve those subscriptions, because all that help will be certainly greatly appreciated from the channel perspective. On that note, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention today and look forward to seeing you again soon on the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.